You know what time it is, no matter where you've been. So let's do it again. Listen up and let the sun shine in. We've got soul training. Time to practice what you preach. Ooh, yeah. Yes, we do. We've got soul training.
Hey, Daniel. Hey, Joe. We are in the minority here. Well, me and Joe are in the minority. This is the first time that we've been outnumbered by Alabama fans. It's 3-2.
It's going to be a good day for you.
Yeah, I wonder. I thought about that all week long as we were coming in to do this. But we are blessed. We just continue to break down barriers here with the Soul Training Machine. We've grown from having 3 microphones to we've had 4 microphones, and now we've got 5. We've got Big Show Joe and Daniel and Ron and Don Williams. We're fortunate to have Ron and Don Williams with us here at our congregation this weekend to conduct a grief seminar. And I know most people would probably not be attracted or motivated by learning about grief unless you have been impacted by grief and loss and challenges and all those the difficult storms that come our way. And but Ron and Don have spent well over, hope I say that right, over 30 years of your life finding ways to help others, support others during those difficult times. So I'm gonna try to, this is gonna be a shocking statement to you, Joe, but I'm gonna try to talk less because we have two extra microphones.
You're on record.
So I'll conclude that we're going to let Ron and Don talk about really 3 questions. Where have they been, where they are, and where are they going in terms of their work? Where have you been? Where did your work begin? Where are you? Kind of what are some things that you're doing now? And then what's the future for Ron and Don as you all do grief ministry and grief work in the coming years? What's next? That's one of my favorite questions to ask is what's next. And I want to get back and circle back around in a few minutes because you all both serve as chaplains, I think, for various agencies. And I have a connection to our local ambulance service and our local fire department when I used to be a dispatcher. So I'll circle back around and ask you some questions about that. And then that's pretty much it. So whoever wants to go first, y'all are 5 minutes apart. So I figure in your lifetime, you've probably argued over a lot of different things. Who's first? So I'll let you all decide that.
Well, obviously, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and here in South Green Congregation. And we've been here before and looking forward to our time together again this weekend. Besides ministry and obviously growing up as preacher kids and knowing what it is to help folks and see that in action with our parents, probably around 1990, we were attending Freed-Hardeman University lectures, and Don mentioned, let's go hear a friend of mine in regard to speaking. I said, what's his topic? He said, preachers in grief. And I said, does he know what he's talking about? Yeah, he's real talented, real skilled in that. So the speaker introduced himself, Bill McDonald, wonderful guy. And he said, next to doctors, it's my opinion that preachers are the world's worst in helping people deal with grief. And I thought, wow.
Nobody went to sleep after that comment.
Yeah, I mean, and then he explained what he meant by that. So I was living in L.A., Lower Alabama.
I've heard you say that before. I use that sometimes. I impress people. I've been to L.A.
Yeah. And so I went home and started trying to prove the guy wrong. So in regard to studying about grief and such things, going to seminars down in Mobile and wherever where I was working. And the more I learned about grief, the more I realized that, I may have done a good job in helping someone at a funeral, but after that, didn't do much. And so we actually started a Bible class where I was preaching at a place called Evergreen, Alabama. And in the midst of that, someone said, hey, we need to offer this to the community. And so I started my first grief sessions with them in the beginning of 1992. And so after doing that, I said something to Don. I said, hey, you need to do this. Don was in West Alabama. And so he started doing it with the congregation where he was, having support classes. And then it just sort of grew from there. We wrote our first book in 1996. And then Don wrote another one in 1998. And we had our first workshop with a church in 1996 or 7, and so it just sort of started from all that.
Wow.
And we're still learning and growing.
Well, and I noticed on the handouts here that you all have been trained formally in counseling and in grief, palliative care. Did that come later, after you all decided that maybe this is something you wanted to do?
Yeah, I got my master's degree, I think, in 96, and Don got the degree from University of Alabama.
It was about 92, 93, thanatology, which is the study of death, and it was a 60-hour course. And so when I was in West Alabama, I'd travel back and forth to Tuscaloosa and take 2 classes at a time and whatever. But, the story Ron tells, he's got started, and ever since then, I've done a grief support class locally. Because of COVID, we're just doing one at our church, Florence Boulevard Church of Christ, on Wednesday nights. And we've had 10 to 12 people, some from outside, but some of our own as well, be a part of it. Because, there's 2 different ideas about grief. Either you are just coming out of the grief journey, which in one sense you always are a part of, or you will be one day, sometimes sooner than you might think, going into your grief journey because of a sudden loss, or because, sadly, COVID has caused a great deal of sudden losses, which makes things just that much harder. And so sometimes people say, well, why come to a grief workshop? Well, if you don't have it now, you will. I mean, love plus loss equals grief. And so we love things, or we love people, but eventually we're going to lose them, whether it be a sudden car accident, whether it be cancer, whether it be COVID, whether it be dementia.
I went to a work or a Challenge Youth Conference, CYC, with our youth group here a few years ago, and the whole theme of that weekend was storms. And that was, you would hear it over and over that weekend, is you're either coming out of a storm, you're in a storm, or you're going into a storm. And for me, that really put a different perspective on things for me.
But think about it. 100% of us deal with grief. 100%. Either we grieve over something or someone that's significant to us, or someone else will grieve over our loss. So we're all affected by it. Doesn't matter who we are or where we are, what we're doing.
That being the case, that everybody is or will deal with grief, what are some things that our listener can do that you would recommend to prepare themselves to better handle grief when it does come?
Great question.
I think, first of all, that you need to be good to yourself, especially in regards to a sudden loss. People sometimes argue which one's worse, an anticipated loss or a sudden loss. And the fact of the matter is, it's a moot point. Grief comes in one size, it's extra large. And whether it was someone who died of cancer, or someone after many years of Alzheimer's who passed away, or if it was, a car accident or something just really sudden, the end result is that a person's going to have grief. And so just understand that with sudden unanticipated losses, it's going to take longer to work through that grief as opposed to the other, because there's a lot more questions and a lot less answers initially. We're going to talk about that this morning in our first session, about sudden loss versus anticipated loss. And so a person needs to be good to themselves, especially because of COVID. COVID has made everything abnormal. People can't grieve like they need to because CDC laws would not even allow, in some cases, funerals unless they were outside and only 10 to a person, 10 to a group. And so people didn't receive the comfort, the love, the care that normally would go along with it. And in some cases, a person may have died and even been buried before you even knew about it because it was
I
just
found
happening.
that to be the case here locally. Is it seemed like that I found myself not going to visitation like I had done in the past.
Right.
Yeah.
Just for that, because some people, I'm like, well, if I don't go, then they might be hurt. If I do go, some people may not want you there.
Right.
And so,
And I think another thing is find people that really care, because that's what you need. You need someone, a group, a church, friends that truly, genuinely care about what you're going through. They've got time for you, or they'll take time for you. And in our hurry up, busy world, it's hard sometimes to find people like that. Obviously, this congregation I know is the kind of folks, but you need someone that cares. And then I think another thing is just recognize that what you're going through is something that others go through, but it's your unique loss, unlike anyone else's, and therefore you're going to have some differences than other people. But don't be afraid of those differences.
and I wanted to, and I appreciate Daniel asking that question too, and I want to kind of circle around to our agenda today too. And you all may not know this, but you all will be long gone when this is released, so we can talk about today. Because I want to I don't want to.
Well, I was going to tell you, we're probably going to kick off the holiday season with your grief, which I guess kind of makes sense because that's a tough time for
Very tough time.
some folks.
Very tough time.
So it'll be sometime around Thanksgiving when this one comes in.
Yeah, people dread the holidays. When whatever loss they're dealing with, they wish they could take November 2nd and fast forward to January 2nd because they don't want to deal with Thanksgiving and Christmas and the beginning of a new year. And so that's grief happens every day, but it's especially hard during that time frame.
And so I wanted to maybe ask a couple of things about today's sessions and then tomorrow's lessons, and nobody's going to hear it. So you're not letting the cat out of the bag.
Explain. Well, I'll explain. Ron and Don are here at South Green Street doing a seminar, so there's not going to be any tomorrow's podcast featuring them. This is the one.
I'm sorry.
So we keep mentioning today or tomorrow. This is a seminar they're doing here at our congregation.
And what I wanted to kind of ask too, and kind of dovetail off Daniel's question is, a lot of times you think about grief and loss, we obviously, and we should think about death, dying, the declining health, that journey and stuff like that. But and I may not be the only one, but I've lost a job in my life. I can remember several years ago, almost 20 years ago, at a local, I'm a full-time public school teacher at a local school district, and I received a pink slip one spring. I was a little bit shocked. I didn't have tenure.
Are they really pink?
Well, I was getting to that. Joe's heard me say that before. They are not pink. I still have my pink slip, by the way, filed away for, sometimes for me to pull out and look at sometimes to kind of remind me of the journey. But the boss called me in the office, slid it across his desk and said, this is a pink slip, And at that time, that was April of a school year. My wife was 8 months pregnant with our first child. And I'd never been without a job before, and I'd never been a father before. No one died. No one had cancer. No one was dealing with dementia. But I didn't know what to do. I was grieving, and it was a loss, and I didn't know what the future held. So what advice do you give? I guess similar advice, what you said, what do you do for someone who has a loss? I mean, we've talked about the economic side.
Comes out of left field, too, not knowing it was going to happen.
Yeah, I was walking around doing what I do, doing my job, and get a call from the boss, who we always had a pretty good relationship, and he just came down from our central office. Sorry.
You got to acknowledge the loss. So in other words, you got to feel the pain. And you're saying, well, I don't have time for that because I'm in panic mode here. But somewhere down the line, you've got to understand, okay, what does this loss mean? And then obviously, what do I do about it? And Don's probably got some ideas on things we can do. But the first thing to do is it's a mistake to say, oh, it's going to be okay, because obviously you've got to deal with your own feelings. In grief, you have a constant battle between the head and the heart. The head's telling you this and the heart's telling you, oh no, it's different. You're going to have to feel this. You're going to have to really deal with the pain. So you have to acknowledge that before you do something about it.
So sit down, take a deep breath, realize the situation. Because I could understand, Alan, and I would probably do the exact same thing you did, is I would be thinking, I've got to earn some money. I got to do something immediately and not deal with the hurt that was caused.
Yeah, me, I wasn't even thinking about me. I was thinking about what's coming in about 8 weeks. That's what I was thinking of, and I was thinking about being the breadwinner, and thinking about Maslow's hierarchy. My family's got to have our basic needs met. So that's where I was. So, and I know some people here have. One of our elders a couple of years ago, one of our major employers went out, and we had several church members. Your father-in-law he already retired, but several people lost their jobs. A massive closing just right before. You all were supposed to be here 2 years ago, almost, and that was one of the things you're going to talk about. Was one of our local factories closing, and so it's impactful. So grief is more than death and dying and loss and all the things that we don't want to think about, but it's also other things too.
Yes, exactly.
Relationships, that's a big area too. But
what advice would you give to parents of younger children and the family experiences some sort of devastating loss? The parents are struggling with their own grief and trying to deal with that, figure out what to do. How can they help their children while yet processing their own grief?
Sometimes children are referred to as the forgotten grievers. There was a study that showed that 44% of them learned about a significant death in their family because they heard all the adults talking over in the corner. If you're old enough to love, you're old enough to mourn.
I heard you say that 10 years ago, and I've used that time and time again.
Right. And so we need to understand that they need to be involved in it. Now, we may not need to give them all the details because we can only process what we can process, and a child may not understand all the economic issues because of the loss of a job or whatever. But at the same time, they need to understand that everything's going to be okay. We're going to make it. This is going to make us better in the long run in regards to what we're having to work through. But there may be some changes in regards to what things may be doing or whatever, and let them be a part of it. I've heard stories of little children who, after hearing about some issues of the job or whatever, bring their piggy bank money and say, Daddy, will this help? I mean, that's sweet. And you appreciate them at least wanting to feel like they're making a contribution because they are a part of the process, and what you need to do is be able to try to help them as well and give them the information that they need. There's some information, people say, well, what do you tell them? Only what they ask for, especially at the beginning. We're talking about young teenagers, it's a different situation, but little children, give them only what they can process at that time. They typically do what they call hit and run, especially younger children. They'll come in and say, now, what did you say about Granddaddy? And then and then they run out and play again. And then they'll come back and say, so now what does that mean? They can't handle it all the time. With us, it's 24/7, but with them, it can't be. But that doesn't mean that they can't be involved in it and they can't even contribute to it. I've seen funerals where, there's a little note or there's a little picture or there's a little something or another there in the casket with the granddaddy because that came from the grandchild. I remember an 18-year-old who'd never been to a funeral, and the first funeral he was going to, which he didn't want to be a part of, was his granddad's. And they asked me, said, what do you do? I said, well, I would bring him in privately, there be a private viewing, let him see his granddad without all the emotions and all the people around. And so sure enough, that night after the visitation was over with, that's what they did. And the next morning I was talking to the family and I said, how did it go? I said, well, it was helpful to him, and said he's going to be here for the funeral, and said every time he saw his granddaddy without fail, his granddaddy would give him a quarter. Now, this was like 25 years ago. But he said, he has put a quarter in his granddaddy's hand. And I thought, wow,
That's something special they had, and a
really-
bond between the two of them.
it was something that he could do, and that was really helpful.
And it allowed him closure.
Yes.
I'll tell you a short story, and y'all, you can grade my parenting, I guess. But we had a family member pass away in our presence, and at that time, my oldest son, Cade, was 6, I guess. And so there was nothing we could really do to shield him from what was happening. But we did try to get him away from the first responders and not see the resuscitation attempts and that sort of thing. But he and this family member had kind of connected that day. He loved this family member, and we didn't really know how to handle that. So what we did was we were just honest with him and told him this man was a member of the Lord's church. And so we told Cade, my oldest, what had happened, what had transpired, and where this family member now was, And he accepted that. But it's like you talked about, just even still today, 2 or 3 years later, Cade will come to me and just mention something about that event. It's always on his mind, but he still has questions. And we didn't want it to affect him long term. And we didn't want to draw anything out and try to dumb down what had happened and have to keep explaining. So we were just honest. How do we do? Because it's something we still deal with a little bit.
You want to look for teachable moments when a situation comes up, going by a funeral, by a cemetery, whatever. If you go and visit the grave, whatever, explain what is there and what's not there, but again, in their terms, in their way. And when you do that, the child will know it's okay to talk about this anytime. And that's what you want, regardless of whatever loss it is. You want the child to know it's going to be okay to talk to mom and dad about this. And of course, if they talk to you about that, they're likely going to talk to you about other things that are going on in their life as well.
That's something I've learned with kids, the evolution of my parenting and failed parenting sometimes is that I've learned that if you don't talk to kids about the little things, they're not going to talk to you about the big things. So no matter how small something is, whether it's a math assignment or something like that, or I'm out of lunch money versus the relationships that they'll have one day. Daniel, you're doing a great job and asking questions. You got any more?
And I'll tell you, Daniel, real quick, we're about 7 minutes left.
Okay. Appreciate that heads up. So what's how long does the typical grief process take? I know every grief is different because every relationship is different, but if somebody's heading into that storm, what hope can you give them as to what to expect? When does light begin to break again?
Obviously, Daniel, that's going to be different for every person because everybody facilitates things differently. There's not any real time frame when it comes to grief. I know that some of the books or whatever may talk about the 1 year and then the 2 year, whatever the situation may be. There's a sense in which we will grieve as long as we live. In regard to the loss that we have with someone, we remember them on special dates, of their lives and of our lives with them. But you go through different phases. That's the phrase that Don and I like to use, phases instead of stages, phases of grief. And, it takes time. So, if someone just needs a time frame, then I would think at least 1.5 to 2, maybe more, probably would be a good understanding of going through the different seasons of one's grief journey. And but it will take more than that. So you don't need to put any expectation that you're not going to graduate Grief 101 if you're past 2 years and you're still feeling some of the great sorrows of that. That doesn't mean that you failed. It just means that you're dealing with a lot of grief, and you're realizing what the losses are. But again, that's what most of the specialists say, at least in those regards.
Also, the idea is that we sometimes use the phrase get over, and you're never going to get over. You have to go through grief and you have to grow through grief. And so it's what you do with your grief, reading appropriate books, being a part of a workshop, being a part of a support group, those type of things, dealing with it, with your friends, dealing with it at church. All those things help you and give you ammunition to sort of successfully get through and continue to grow and be a different person on the other side of your grief than before. And so that's something that people have to keep in mind.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask one question because we're wrapping up. I want to get this in. So what do we all deal with grief. We all know people dealing with grief. You go to the funeral home. What do you tell people? That's the trouble that I think everybody has. What do you say to folks? Or is it a case-by-case type of deal?
The simplest one that I've ever heard and I thought was the greatest was this lady in our class said, whenever I'm standing there beside a loved one who's standing there beside their casket, I'll say, I don't know how you feel, but can I give you a hug? Because that tells them two things. First of all, they truly don't understand because you don't. That wasn't your mom, that wasn't your husband, whatever the case may be. And so that statement turns people off. I know how you feel. No, you don't, because it's an entirely different situation. So by saying that, I don't know how you feel, but can I give you a hug, shows that I'm here for you and I want to be here for you. And pre-COVID, we could easily say that. Now we have to be a little more careful about hugs and such like. But you let people know, I don't know where you're coming from, but I want you to know that I care. And as long as they know that, they're willing to accept you.
Simple words. I am sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through. I love you. I'll be praying for you. That's all that needs to be said at that point in time. Based upon the loss and how it happened, they may be able to understand and remember what you're saying, or they may not. So just the simple things are the best.
I can remember 10 years ago or so when I met you, something I've taken from that time is you said, to Joe's question, you all said you don't have to say anything, just your presence. Your presence, right. I mean, it says it all. But you don't so you don't put pressure on yourself. So.
Right.
I think people tend to remember your demeanor and your compassion more than they do your actual words.
Right.
As we kind of wrap up, the only couple are the 2 points I wanted to ask, I guess, is what should we expect from your lesson tomorrow or the class? How can the church help the church?
Well, I think we need to understand what the church is from a biblical concept, and we'll be talking about that. But then also, by following the example of our Lord, who the Bible uses the phrase, he was moved with compassion. Study that phrase several times because of what he did. He fed them spiritually, but he also took care of their needs. He fed them physically. And we need to, Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens and then fulfill the law of Christ. Try to look for ways we can help people in times of their need. And then the third part of that lesson is going to be very practical, using the Good Samaritan. And so I'll tell it ahead of time so people tomorrow won't have heard this. But in the story of the Good Samaritan, who are we? What part in that Good Samaritan do we play? Are we the Samaritan? Willing to work outside the box? He's journeying, he's traveling, but he just has compassion and sees after somebody. Are we the bandages? Are we willing to be hands-on with people and try to help people in their journey? Are we the money, the denarii? Do we have opportunities? Maybe physically we can't help people, but because of our material blessings, we can help people in their losses, or we help people in their journey, whatever the case may be. are we the donkey? Think about that. That guy can't get to the end without that beast of burden that he was on. Are we willing to take people places where they need to go? Are we willing to be that hands-on with folks? And so we'll look at that from a very practical point, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about.
When this podcast releases, it'll be too late for our listeners to attend this particular grief seminar. So, what are some ways that our dear listener that is thinking about grief could access some of your tools?
Go to Rondon Books, www.rondonbooks.com. There's information there concerning the books that we've written. Also, we've done a tract, a brochure that we've done that the church perhaps will have here at South Green. Obviously, there's other ways to contact us, and that there on the website, there's information there of contacting us if you need to do so. And we'll be glad to help you in any kind of way.
And I'll mention, too, if you can't get a hold of Ron and Don, contact Soul Training, and we'll get you in contact with them.
And the final question I want to ask, too, is how underserved do you think emergency services and law enforcement are in terms of having grief support? Some may be better than others, but I was I was just a weekend warrior, a lowly weekend part-time dispatcher for 10 years. In my first 6 years, I worked for our local ambulance service, and at that time, they had I never needed it, I don't think, but our EMTs and medics, the guys on the truck, they never had any type of grief support. They'd have a debriefing occasionally after something major happened, but there was never continuous. And I think that's where we drop the ball spiritually in the church, in any form of life, is you're not feeding yourself along. You wait until something big happens, and then you have that debriefing. So how underserved do you think?
Well, it's so hard for them to deal with so many other things, and then they have to deal with their own feelings. And they probably will put that on the back burner and deal with all the other things they have to take care of. Just realize when they come home to their husbands and their wives and family members, they need loving people taking care of them and others as well.
Well, this has been wonderful. Appreciate you all being with us. And it's, again, I find myself at the end, Joe, saying I do not want this to end, but it has to. So we're going to let Daniel. We're going to throw the ball to Daniel. I don't know how well he catches, but we're going to throw the ball to him, and we're going to let him kind of run us across the end zone here.
Well, hopefully I'll catch better than some Alabama receivers did last week.
I was fixing to say you are talking to a bunch of Alabama fans.
I was expecting to take a shot at me, but I'm glad he did. His words, not mine. His name's Daniel Gaines.
12 dropped balls. Who's counting?
It's ridiculous, right? But we are very thankful, Ron and Don, for you guys being with us. This has been a blessing to us, and I think it'll be a blessing to our listeners as well. And dear listener, we want to thank you for letting us be a part of your day. If you have a response, we would love to hear feedback from you. Email us, let us know what questions you have. Talk to us about your grief and things that have been helpful to you or difficult to you. We want to hear from you. And as always, want to thank our producer, Big Show Joe, my co-host, Alan Jones, and the elders at the South Green Street Church of Christ for making this possible. And until next time, keep soul training.
Soul training. Time to practice what you preach. Ooh, yeah. Yes, we do. We've got soul training.
To learn more, you can email us at soultrainingpodcast@gmail.com, or you can write to us, P.O. Box 503, Glasgow, Kentucky, 42142. That's Soul Training.